everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat.
So over here in Exodus 12, verse 6, we have the following verse. It says, talking about the Passover, "Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall keep it." So that he's talking about the lamb, shall kill it at twilight. So in other words, the Israelites, this is discussing the institution of Passover and how they would take this lamb on the 10th day of the month, and for 4 days they would keep this lamb in their home, and then they would kill it on the 14th day of the Passover, or the 14th day of the month, which was Passover. And it says they will kill it between the evenings. Or I'm looking here at, it says at twilight in the New King James. But if you look in the marginal, if you look at the Hebrew, it literally means between the evenings, or the Hebrew is bein erev. Bein erev. Erev is evening. Bein, B-E-Y-N, is the way I would translate that. I looked at the Hebrew and that's how I would transliterate it. Means between. So this phrase, the question is, when was the Passover lamb to be killed, and when was it to be celebrated? Let me just say, Passover is the Hebrew word Pesach, and it comes from the word Pasak, which can have two different meanings. It can mean the sacrifice, the lamb itself that was sacrificed, the Passover lamb, and it can also, as that term is used in the Bible, it can also refer to the day on which the Passover was killed. So it can refer to the sacrifice itself, the lamb that was killed, as well as the celebration of the day itself. And then the meal, which we now call a Seder, that happened at the end of the day. So the question is, when it says the lamb is to be killed between the evenings, this has given rise to a lot of debate among people as to, do you celebrate the Passover you kill the lamb at the beginning of the 14th and then celebrate Passover at the beginning, the 13th going into the 14th? Or do you celebrate it at the end of the 14th going into the 15th? Remember, Hebraic, biblical Hebrew days, biblical days do not begin at midnight. They begin at the setting of the sun in the evening, and when the sun sets, that begins the new day. So day begins at the setting of the sun of the previous day, and so by the time you come along to midnight, you might already be anywhere from 3 to 6 hours into the day already. Actually, it's not day literally. It's the night portion. So you have night, and then you have the night portion of a day, and then you have the day portion, and that's how it has been. How it has been since the creation. It was night and then day, and so that's when Passover starts. The 14th day begins at sundown of the previous day. So the question is, what does Bein Erev mean? Well, I studied this out for many, many years. I grew up keeping Passover at the beginning of the 14th day. The Bible just says keep the Passover in the evening, slaughter the lamb, and keep Passover between the evening of the 14th day. So some people believe that would be at the beginning of the Passover, from the 13th day going into and after sundown. Other people, like the Orthodox Jews, the Rabbinic Jews, they do it at the end of the 14th day going into the 15th day. And there's been this debate. So I grew up, my family, for 3 generations, we kept it at the beginning of the 14th day. And about 15 or 16 years ago, I was being challenged by somebody, "No, you should do it at the end." So that's when the Jews do it. And I was resistant to that idea, and so I decided to study it out myself and write an article Well, this is one of those cases where I studied it out, and I actually wrote an article and ended up agreeing with the guy that was opposing me on it. I changed my mind. Well, but then I can never get around the fact that Yeshua did it at the beginning. He did it after the 13th was done and going into the 14th, at the beginning. That's when he did his supper. He couldn't do it at the end because he was being crucified at that time. So he did a Passover Seder. He went into the Garden of Gethsemane. He was apprehended, and then they took him. They arrested Yeshua, and then he appeared before the high priests and those guys, and then he appeared before Pilate, and then he was crucified, and he went on the stake somewhere between 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock in the morning, depending on which gospel account you look at, and he died about the 9th hour, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that was the 14th day of the first month. It was on Passover. He died on the cross at the same time, according to historical records, when they were the Jews, the priests up on the Temple Mount were sacrificing the Passover lamb to the time of the evening sacrifice between about 3 and 3:30 in the afternoon. That's when Yeshua died. He fulfilled that. So he could not keep the Passover at the end of the day when all the rest of the Jews were doing it, because that's when he had to be being the Passover lamb, dying on the cross. He had to fulfill that. So some people say, well, we can do it at the beginning of the day because that's when Yeshua did it. Or some people say, well, we have to do it, follow the Torah example, and do it at the end of the day. And I say, look, I've said for years, I'm not going to argue with Yeshua, and I'm not going to argue with the Torah. You can do it at the beginning or at the end, as long as you're doing it on the 14th. As long as that lamb was killed on the 14th, I don't care if you eat your meal at the beginning or at the end going into the 15th. I can make a case either way, because Yeshua did the one, and the Israelites in the Torah, it says to do the other. But I really think that the key to understanding this is in the phrase Bein Erev, and I have heard this talked about by people that knew Hebrew and knew this and knew that and tried to prove their point one way or the other and tied the whole thing up in knots. I mean, I've heard this discussed for the last 40 years. Unbelievable. More than 40 years. And finally one day it dawned on me, this is not complicated. I don't know why people make things so complicated. But before I tell you what the answer is to understand this and to resolve this difficulty, there are different understandings as to what between the evenings can mean. Well, first of all, the term Erev means twilight. Okay, this is what it says in a lot of our Bibles. But twilight is Bein Erev. It means, twilight, we know what twilight is. Okay, we know what twilight is as the sun is going down. Most of us look at twilight as that time between, when the sun has just hitting the horizon and it's still light but not quite, and then the sun goes below the horizon and we still have that time where it's still light just before it gets dark. That's what we consider twilight. So it's between the evenings. Well, Erev in Hebraic thought, or evening, can forget the Bein Erev, just the word Erev can mean several things. It can mean twilight, but it can also in Hebraic thought mean the time from which the sun is at its highest point at midday, at its zenith, and as it begins to descend toward the west, and that can, until it sets at sunset, whatever time that happens to be. That would be between the evenings, or that would be evening. And Edersheim makes this point in his book Life and Times of Jesus, page 813. And this was an understanding in Hebraic thought as to between the evenings. The other one could mean also from just that twilight period, like I talked about earlier. That was another understanding. But the problem is that the preposition Bein, between, modifies Erev. So yes, Erev can be that twilight period between while the sun's setting, or when the sun starts to go down at 12 noon forward. But that doesn't account for the modifying preposition bain, between the evenings. So you have evenings plural, between the evenings. To my way of thinking and logic, that between the evenings, look, the evening of the 14th is one evening. The evening of the 15th is another evening, singular, if you're talking about each one. If you're talking about both evenings, evening of the 13th of the first month going into the 14th, that's evening 1. Evening 2 would be the evening of the 14th going into the 15th day of the first month on the biblical calendar. That's the second evening. These are the two evenings, plural, between which the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed. The Israelites had a whole period of day in which to prepare and sacrifice the lamb and get it cooking on a spit, which would take a few hours over an open fire before they can eat it that evening. They had all day to prepare and then to be eating it. And indeed, the Israelites, I believe, they were eating it in the evening of the 15th, and that evening they left on the Exodus. That's why they ate with their sandals on and their loins girded and their staves in their hands. I got a staff here somewhere. Somebody gave this to me. And they sat there with their staff and their sandals on. I don't have sandals, I got slippers on right now. Keep my feet warm. And they had their loins girded. They had their belts on. And they were ready to get up and go afterwards, and they headed out of the land of Egypt. That was called the Exodus. Now, in the time of Yeshua in the 1st century, the population of Jerusalem was between about 100 to 125,000 people. But during the biblical feasts like Passover and unleavened bread, the population would swell to around, I believe, around 1 million people. People would come in from all around, Jews and proselytes. And they would kill, I believe, and I'd have to look at my notes on this. I read so much that I have a lot of details floating around up in my brain, and I don't always remember where I read it or the exact, but I think they killed around 250,000 lambs. And if you go read Edersheim, they were doing this in shifts. It took them all day up on the Temple Mount to be killing all of these lambs that then they would slaughter them. The Levites would collect the blood, and then they would have to skin them. Look, I've butchered a lot of sheep I grew up on a sheep farm. It takes a while. I mean, it takes about an hour and a half to butcher a lamb, and we got pretty good at it. My dad and I butchered a lot of sheep over a period of about 15 years. Dozens and dozens and dozens. But it still takes an hour and a half to kill it, to dress it, to field dress it, and then to hang it up and gut it and get it ready. Get it ready to cut up for meat, or in this case, they would put on a spit and a rotisserie. And so it would take about 3 or 4 hours then to cook it, and then they would cook it at their places, their homes, or where they were staying. So here you had several 100,000, a couple 250,000 or so lambs being slaughtered, and it took all day. So they were sacrificing lambs for people to go back and have their Passover Seder in their home all day long, until finally in the afternoon, then the priest killed the national sacrifice, if you will, up on the altar. And that was the one that was killed for the whole nation. And so I believe, based on understanding what Bein Erev, between the evenings, they could have had their Passover Seder any time after the going down of the sun of the 13th, going into the 14th. And as long as they killed the Passover lamb on the 14th, which is according to Scripture, and dressed it and were cooking it, and then they could eat it anytime after that, even into the 15th day, which is exactly when the Israelites did it in the land of Egypt, and which is what the Jews do to this day. And that evening they would have left. They would have left on the first day of the unleavened bread, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Hag HaMatzot, on the 15th day of the first month, which is the Exodus. So that's how I resolved that difficulty. So yes, Yeshua had his Passover Seder on the 14th day, and that was totally at the beginning, and the Jews do it at the end, and it's still within between the evenings of both days, when they are actually doing their lamb and preparing it, getting the rest of their leavening in another house, and preparing themselves for the meal, which now in modern times goes into the evening of the 15th. So I have no problem with people that keep a Passover Seder at the beginning of the 14th, or that do it at the end, just as long as you're doing you're preparing, you're doing your preparation. And I'm not advocating killing a Passover lamb. Yeshua was killed. He died on the cross once and for all as our Passover lamb, so I don't recommend doing that. I mean, you could do it as an exercise, but it's not a replacement for him. He did it once and for all. But that's how I resolve that difficulty. You can do it at the beginning or the end, and either one is within the confines, or within the guidelines of Scripture.
He found, call upon his name. He's near, he's near, he's near. Yeshu Hashem Behir Matzov Kerabu Yoto Karov Yasov Rasha Darko Veishavim Machshevotav Yashovel Ad Hashem Ki Arbe Is Yeshu Hashem Behir Matzov Keravu Yota Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon his name. He is near, he is near. Yeshua Hashem Behim Matzot Kerahu